Imagine standing on a mountaintop and suddenly the person next to you is blazing with light, his face shining like the sun, and a voice from a cloud says, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." What do you do with that?
I think I would fall on my face, which, as it turns out, is exactly what the disciples did.
Welcome to Matthew, the King and His Kingdom, Portraits of Jesus, Part 2. I am Jon, and I am here with Lauren, and we are so glad you are joining us for Lesson 9, Pivotal, Defining Moments.
We are walking through Matthew the 17, 18, and 19 today. And the lesson aim is to observe key moments that define Jesus' mission and ministry. And I have to say, these 3 chapters deliver on that in a serious way.
They really do. And before we dive in, it is worth just placing ourselves in the story. Last week in Lesson 8, we were deep in Matthew 14 through 16. We traced Jesus withdrawing from the crowds, the feeding miracles, his identity as the bread of life, Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and the first clear prediction of the cross.
And we ended with that cross-shaped call in Matthew 16:24. If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. That is the note Matthew chapter 16 closes on. And now chapter 17 opens 6 days later with something that answers the question those words would have raised in every disciple's heart.
Suffering and glory go together. That is the thread running through everything Jesus is doing in these chapters. And the Transfiguration is the first and most stunning expression of it. So let us set the scene.
Matthew 16:28 is the bridge verse. Jesus says, "Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." That is a promise, and it is fulfilled almost immediately.
6 days later. Matthew 17:1 says, "Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves." And what happens on that mountain is unlike anything else recorded in the Gospel.
Let me read it. Matthew the 17:2 through 5. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him."
That is the key text for this entire lesson, right there. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Matthew 17:5. And there is so much packed into that moment.
So, the first talk about it question goes straight to this. The lesson asks, what is the significance of the Transfiguration as a defining moment? And what can we learn from Peter's suggestion, God's interruption, and the disappearance of Moses and Elijah?
Let us start with why the Transfiguration matters structurally, because it does not just appear out of nowhere. Jesus has just told the disciples he is going to suffer and die. He has called them to take up their cross, and he has promised that some of them will see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom before they die. The Transfiguration is the fulfillment of that promise.
And it is doing something very specific. It is showing these 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, what glory actually looks like. Yes, the cross is coming. Yes, suffering is real. But this is who Jesus is on the other side of all of that.
Suffering and glory are not opposites in Jesus' kingdom. They are sequential, and the Transfiguration is the evidence. You needed to see the glory to trust the suffering was worth it.
Now, Moses and Elijah appear with him, and that detail is not incidental. These are not random figures. Moses represents the law, Elijah represents the prophets, the entire Hebrew Bible, its covenants, its revelation, its promises, is represented by these two men standing on that mountain.
And Matthew 5:17 is the anchor here. Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." That is what this scene is dramatizing visually. Moses and Elijah are there because Jesus is their fulfillment. He is not replacing them. He is completing what they pointed toward.
Which makes what happens next so important. Peter, seeing Moses and Elijah alongside Jesus, suggests building 3 tabernacles, one for each of them. It is a well-meaning impulse. He wants to honor the moment. But the suggestion places Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah.
And the Father does not let that stand. Notice Matthew's precise detail. While he was still speaking, the Father interrupts Peter mid-sentence. The voice comes out of the cloud and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And then Moses and Elijah are gone.
Only Jesus remains. That is the theological statement of the Transfiguration. Moses pointed to him, Elijah announced him, but Jesus is the one you hear now. He is not one voice among many. He is the voice.
The disappearance of Moses and Elijah is not a slight against them. It is the natural order of fulfillment. When the full thing arrives, the sign that pointed to it steps aside. You do not hold on to the signpost once you are standing at the destination.
And for Peter, who had just been rebuked for resisting the cross, this moment is an anchor. You are not following a martyr. You are following the King of Glory who knows exactly where he is going and who has the Father's full blessing on every step of that path.
The disciples' response in verse 6 is telling. They fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. And Jesus comes and touches them and says, "Arise and do not be afraid." That touch is so human and so tender after something so overwhelming.
And Jesus instructs them to tell no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. The resurrection is already in view. Even the Transfiguration is pointing forward to Easter morning.
This is a defining moment because it answers the question the cross raises. You can trust the suffering because the glory is real. You have seen it with your own eyes.
And the question for us is, what do we do with the Moses and Elijah temptation in our own lives? The tendency to put Jesus on level footing with other voices, other teachers, other traditions, as if he is one among several.
The Father's answer to that is the same as it was on the mountain. Hear him. Not them alongside him. Him.
That is a word worth sitting with. Okay, let us move to the second talk about it question, which takes us down the mountain and into a very different scene.
Immediately after the Transfiguration, Jesus and the 3 disciples come down the mountain and are met by a crowd, and at the center of it is a desperate father with a demon-possessed son. And the other 9 disciples have been trying to cast out the demon and have failed.
Matthew 17:14 through 16 sets it up. And when they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, kneeling down to him and saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him."
The contrast here could not be sharper. The mountain, glory, the Father's voice, the King in blazing light, the valley, a suffering child, a helpless father, 9 disciples who tried and failed.
And Jesus' response is striking. Verse 17, "Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me." There is something in that sounds almost weary. Not angry exactly, but carrying the weight of what he sees.
He rebukes the demon and the boy is cured immediately. And then come the verses the second question focuses on. The disciples come to Jesus privately and ask why they could not cast it out. Matthew 17:19 through 21.
Let me read that. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" So Jesus said to them, "Because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting."
So the answer is twofold. First, unbelief. Second, this particular kind requires prayer and fasting, and those two answers are not unrelated.
Right, because prayer and fasting are the very practices that build and sustain faith. You do not pray and fast as a technique to unlock more spiritual power. You pray and fast because they orient you away from self-sufficiency and toward complete dependence on God.
And the disciples had been doing ministry. They had been sent out in chapter 10, they had seen healings, they had cast out demons before. It is possible they began to approach this situation out of habit, out of what had worked before, rather than out of fresh dependence on God.
There is something really honest in this moment. These are the disciples, the ones who had just been with Jesus on the mountain, well, 3 of them, or who had been carrying his ministry, and they could not do it. Unbelief does not always look like obvious doubt. Sometimes it looks like going through the motions.
The mustard seed image is fascinating. Jesus is not saying you need a massive, heroic faith. He is saying that genuine faith, even tiny, genuine faith, is more powerful than practiced religious action without real trust. It is the quality of faith, not the quantity.
And the prayer and fasting comment is a corrective that feels very pastoral. Jesus is not humiliating them. He is diagnosing the gap and pointing to the remedy. You need to be the kind of disciples who are regularly in communion with God. That is where the power for this kind of encounter flows from.
Mark's version of this story, in Mark 9:29, only records the prayer and fasting answer. Matthew includes both the unbelief diagnosis and the prayer and fasting. The study guide suggests Matthew may have included both to underscore that spiritual disciplines and miracle-working faith belong together. They are not separate categories.
Faith is not passive. It is cultivated. And the disciples needed to hear that, and honestly, so do we. There will be moments in ministry, in prayer, in the fight against darkness in our own lives, when we reach into what we thought was our toolkit and find it empty. And the invitation in that moment is not shame. It is return to the source.
And Jesus' willingness to cast out the demon immediately, without hesitation, is itself a portrait of the King and his power. The whole valley scene functions as the other side of the mountaintop. On the mountain, glory and identity. In the valley, power and compassion. And Jesus is equally at home in both.
That is such a good framing. He did not stay on the mountain. He came down into the valley because that is where the suffering child was.
All right, let us move into chapter 18, because this is where the lesson takes a significant turn. From power and identity, we move to kingdom values. And talk about it. Question 3 asks, how does Jesus define who is greatest in the kingdom?
Matthew 18:1 sets up the question. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And this question almost certainly has some jealousy in the background.
The 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, had just been taken up the mountain for something the other 9 were not included in. And you can imagine the dynamic that creates. Who is in the inner circle? Who matters most? Who is Jesus' favorite?
It is a very human question. And the fact that the disciples are asking it is not a mark against them. It shows they have not yet fully absorbed what Jesus has been teaching. But they are asking, which is already better than not asking.
And Jesus does not answer with a lecture. He answers with a child. Matthew 18:2-5. Let me read that. Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me.
There is so much in this. First, entry into the kingdom itself requires becoming like a child. Not childish, but childlike. There is a difference.
Childlike trust, childlike dependence. A child in the ancient world did not have social status. A child was not a power player. A child could not leverage connections or reputation. A child simply received.
And that is exactly what the kingdom requires. Not achievement, not hierarchy, not religious accomplishment, but the posture of someone who knows they are entirely dependent on the Father. The question, who is greatest, is already oriented in the wrong direction. It assumes the kingdom runs on the same logic as the world.
And Jesus completely overturns that assumption with a single object lesson. You want to know who is greatest? It is whoever can get low. Whoever can abandon pride and self-assertion and become like this child.
The word he uses is humbles himself. It is an active choice. Humility in Jesus' teaching is not a personality trait. It is a decision. You choose to place yourself in a posture of dependence rather than competition.
And the last sentence of verse 5 is remarkable. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Jesus identifies himself with the child, the lowly, the small, the without status. How you treat the least is how you treat him.
Which previews where the passage goes next, because Jesus takes this further and warns against causing the little ones to stumble. And that is the fourth talk about it question, and it is a weighty one.
Matthew 18:6-7. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck, and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes.
That language is as strong as anything Jesus says in the entire gospel. A millstone around the neck, drowned in the depth of the sea. This is not measured or moderate language. It is designed to stop you cold.
And the lesson asks why the consequence is so severe and how Christians might be guilty of this offense. The first thing to notice is that Jesus is doing something layered with the phrase, little ones. He is not only talking about children, though he is certainly including them.
He is also talking about new believers, people young in faith, the recently converted, the spiritually fragile, the ones who are just beginning to trust. And the warning applies equally to both groups.
Think about what it means to cause a child to stumble. The vulnerability of children, their dependence on adults who are supposed to protect them, means that the damage done to them can be profound and lasting. Jesus takes that seriously in a way that leaves no room for minimizing.
And in the church context, think about what it means to cause a new convert to stumble. Someone is just starting to trust. They are taking early, tender steps of faith. They come into a community that is supposed to be shaped by the love of Christ. And instead, they encounter hypocrisy or coldness or spiritual abuse or a Christianity that looks nothing like the Jesus who called them.
The damage in that moment is not just relational, it is spiritual. You have put yourself between that person and their first steps toward God. That is what Jesus will not tolerate. The millstone language is there to make sure we feel the weight of it.
And the lesson asks how Christians might be guilty of this. I think the honest answer is that this can happen without malice. You do not have to intend to harm someone to cause them to stumble. A dismissive comment about a new believer's questions. An unwelcoming community that never quite includes the person who does not fit. A long-tenured church member who makes it clear, implicitly or explicitly, that certain people do not belong.
Or the leader who uses spiritual language to manipulate and control. Or the parent who presents a version of faith that is more about rule-keeping than relationship and drives their child away from God entirely. Jesus says the consequence of being that person is severe.
The study guide makes a point that is worth naming here. Christians are to be stepping stones for one another, not stumbling blocks. That is a beautiful way to put it. The question every believer should ask is, am I making it easier or harder for the people around me to take their next step toward Jesus?
And the verses that follow, 8 and 9, where Jesus talks about cutting off a hand or plucking out an eye, are not meant literally. They are hyperbole designed to communicate urgency. Whatever in your life is causing you or others to stumble, treat it with that level of seriousness. Do not minimize it. Do not accommodate it. Remove it.
The hyperbole is in service of the real point. Take this seriously. The stakes are that high. The souls of little ones are that precious to the Father.
And Jesus follows that with the parable of the lost sheep in verses 10 through 14, which extends the same logic. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? Matthew 18:12. The Father actively pursues the ones who wander. So we should too.
Which means causing a little one to stumble is not just harming that person. It is working against the very heart of God, who leaves the 99 to find the one. You do not want to be in the position of causing the wandering that the Father is grieving over.
Let me also just note briefly that the quarterly walks through a few other sections of these chapters that we are not covering in the Talk About It questions today, but that are rich for personal study. The temple tax miracle in Matthew 17:24 through 27, where Jesus is penniless and produces a coin from a fish's mouth. That portrait of the king in his humility is worth your time.
And the church discipline process in Matthew 18:15 through 20. That passage addresses how a community of believers handles sin between members, and the goal is always restoration. And then the parable of the unforgiving servant in verses 22 through 35, which follows Peter asking about forgiveness limits, and Jesus essentially saying, there are no limits.
Peter's suggestion of forgiving 7 times was meant to be generous. The Pharisees capped it at 3. 7 felt extravagant. Jesus says not 7 times, but 70 times 7, which is not a math equation. It is a statement that forgiveness from the heart does not keep a running tally.
1 Corinthians 13:5 says, love thinks no evil. Or, in the NIV, love keeps no record of wrongs. That is the theological parallel. Genuine love doesn't carry a ledger. And the parable that follows makes the point unforgettable. If the master forgave an unpayable debt, how can the servant withhold forgiveness over something comparatively small?
And chapter 19 takes us through the question on marriage and divorce, which the Pharisees bring as a test, and the blessing of the children and the rich young ruler. All of these are in the quarterly's background, reading and worth careful private study.
The rich young ruler encounter alone could sustain an entire conversation. A man who has kept the commandments, who is earnest, who runs to Jesus and kneels, and yet goes away sorrowful because his wealth has him, rather than him having his wealth.
And it ends this section of Matthew with a statement that ties back to the greatness question in chapter 18. Matthew 19:30. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. The kingdom's logic is consistently the inversion of the world's logic. That thread runs all the way through these chapters.
So, let us bring all of this together with the reflect on it prompt, because it is a beautiful one. Great leaders are defined by what they do with their power and their concern for their most vulnerable followers. By that criterion, Jesus is the greatest leader who ever lived.
I love that framing because it takes every portrait we have looked at in this lesson and holds them up against a single standard. The Transfiguration. What does Jesus do with his power? He uses it to reveal the Father's glory, not his own. He comes back down the mountain to heal a suffering boy.
The valley scene. He does not criticize the disciples publicly for their failure. He teaches them. He points them toward the disciplines that will make them stronger. That is a leader who is invested in the growth of his people.
The greatness question. Jesus redefines the entire category of greatness around the child, around humility, around service. He does not use his position to establish a hierarchy. He uses it to dismantle one.
And the warning about the little ones. He is specifically protecting the most vulnerable followers. The children, the new believers, the ones who could easily be overlooked or harmed. He does not say, "The strong will be fine. Do not worry about the edges." He says, "Anyone who harms the least of these answers to me."
When I sit with this reflection, I think about what it means to lead in any context, a home, a classroom, a church, a workplace, and ask what the transfiguration pattern looks like there. Power used in the service of others rather than the advancement of self. Attention given to the most vulnerable rather than the most impressive.
And I think about the childlike trust question in a very personal way. The disciples were asking, "Who is greatest?" And Jesus said the entry requirement for the kingdom is to become like a child. I ask myself honestly, am I still doing that? Or have I been in faith long enough that I have started to operate out of what I know rather than who I trust?
That is one of the most searching things about these chapters. The longer you follow Jesus, the more temptation there is to replace dependence with familiarity. The disciples had seen miracles, they had been given authority, and they still failed in the valley because somewhere the root of active, trusting faith had thinned out.
The invitation in all of this is to stay childlike, not naive, not shallow, but dependent, trusting, oriented toward the Father the way a small child looks up to a parent when everything is too big.
And the Transfiguration gives us the basis for that trust. This is who Jesus is, the Father's beloved Son, fulfillment of everything the law and the prophets pointed toward, the voice you hear when Moses and Elijah step aside.
Hear him. That is the whole lesson 9 in 2 words.
2 words that everything else in Matthew is asking us to act on. We are getting closer in Matthew's narrative to Jerusalem. The shadow of the cross is lengthening. And next week's lesson will take us further into that movement, into the tension and confrontation that builds as the king enters the city.
If you are studying with the quarterly, Matthew 17 through 19 is this week's reading, and we would encourage you to go slowly through chapter 18 especially. The child in the middle of the room, the lost sheep, the millstone, the unforgiving servant. That chapter alone is a complete picture of what the community of the king is supposed to look like.
And sit with the Transfiguration. Matthew 17, 1 through 13. Read it slowly. Let the visual do its work. Blazing light, the Father's voice, Moses and Elijah stepping back, only Jesus remaining. That is an image worth carrying with you.
And ask the question honestly, who is greatest in my kingdom? Not Jesus' kingdom, but mine, the one I actually live in day to day. The answer to that question is one of the most revealing things you can know about yourself.
Thank you so much for being with us today. These chapters are rich, and we have only scratched the surface of what Matthew is doing here. Every lesson in this series has felt that way, and we are grateful you are in it with us.
Lesson 10 is ahead, and it takes us into Jerusalem and into some of the most charged public confrontations in the entire gospel. Matthew is building towards something, and the next lesson is going to make that very clear.
Until then, keep studying. Keep asking the questions. The King is worth every moment you give to understanding who he is and what he came to do.
Thank you for listening. We will see you next time